Chapter 3 fundamentally talks about the nature or behavior of costs. In Chapter 2, you were introduced to different types of production costs, and just as a recap, I'm going to go talk about them one more time. First of all, I had defined the generic term cost as the economic sacrifice incurred or the economic resources given up or foregone to obtain an asset. I had also said that there are a multiplicity of qualifiers to the term cost. You have already run across one of those distinctions in Chapter 2, which was manufacturing or production costs versus non-manufacturing or non-production costs, costs incurred in any function other than manufacturing. Further, you noticed that production costs or manufacturing costs were subdivided into three sub-elements. There were direct materials costs, direct labor costs, and manufacturing overhead costs. To recap, direct material costs are those costs of those materials that are physically incorporated into or physically traceable to the end product and that are significant in value. Direct labor is the cost of that labor that is performed directly on the end product, sometimes called touch labor, which is significant in value. All the costs incurred in a factory are considered production costs. So you can imagine that beyond direct material costs and direct labor costs, there is a huge number of other costs incurred in the factory. All those other costs are lumped together into one sub-element called manufacturing overhead costs. Transitioning to Chapter 3. It is one of the basic objectives of every manager to maximize profitability. Obviously, profitability depends on the relationship between revenues and costs. So one of the things that managers have to do is to manage costs. When you want to manage something or control something, you fundamentally have to understand the behavior or nature of that thing or that entity. So Chapter 3 will deal with the nature or behavior of costs. When we discuss the nature or behavior of cost, we break up total costs into two elements. There are fixed costs and there are variable costs. To properly define each of those, you must do so both on a total basis and a per unit basis. So, fixed costs are those costs which in total remain constant, which in total do not change as volume or level of activity changes, but only within a relevant range and for a specified period of time. If you go outside the relevant range of output or you go into another period, total fixed costs will change. On a per unit basis, they behave in the opposite direction of volume or level of activity. As volume goes up, fixed cost per unit goes down and vice versa. Variable costs, on the other hand, are those which in total vary directly with volume or level of activity. That means that if volume goes up by 10%, total variable costs will go up by 10%. And on a per unit basis, they remain constant. They don't change on a per unit basis. So if the variable cost of the first unit is $5, then the variable cost of the 100th unit or the billionth unit is assumed to be $5. Now, for certain types of costs, they have both a variable element and a fixed element, and they are called mixed costs. So for managerial purposes, it is very important to take each cost and break it and signify whether it is a variable cost or a fixed cost, and if it is a mixed cost, to break it up into its variable and fixed components. So chapter 3 has shown you different approaches to breaking up a mixed cost into its variable and fixed element. There is a method that is called the account analysis method. That is an accounting method. You look at each account and then you determine as a manager by looking at what that cost was incurred for or the circumstances surrounding it, which part is variable, which part is fixed. That is the account analysis method. There is another method that is called the scatter graph method. To go to a diversion for a second, if you are going to break up mixed costs into variable costs and fixed costs, what you must have is a set of data. Each data point will be that mixed cost at a certain volume or level of activity. So you will have, perhaps from an accounting perspective, you will have data points for each month for that cost and the volume at which that cost was incurred. So if you have those data points, you can plot them on a graph and you can see what the scatter diagram looks like, and then you can visually fit a line through that set of data points. There are certain basic problems with the scatter graph method, and one of those is that it is individual dependent. Any particular individual looking at the same scatter plot can come to a different conclusion about what the regression line looks like. Also, there is no measure of the goodness of fit in a scatter diagram or scatter plot approach. This is explained in the textbook. Another way of classifying mixed costs into variable or fixed elements is called the high-low method. In this case, you choose the highest point in terms of the total cost and the volume, and the lowest point in terms of the total cost and the volume, and connect those 2 points together to give you the fitted line from which you can read off total fixed cost, which is the y-intercept, and the slope of the line, which would be the variable cost per unit or something. Again, there are some deficiencies associated with this method. They are that the high point and the low point might be anomalous, which means that they do not really represent the set of data. So you can come up with extreme measures for total fixed cost and the variable cost per unit, but it is often employed. Some people have suggested using second highest, second lowest, third highest, third lowest. Another deficiency is that again there is no measure of the goodness of fit. The chapter shows you how to do the calculations. It's a pretty straightforward method and you are responsible for it for the test. The most sophisticated method of breaking up mixed costs into variable and fixed elements is called regression analysis. I'm not going to teach you regression analysis. You will probably study that in a course in statistics, but you are responsible for reading the output of a regression analysis. So, in a simple regression, there is one dependent. The dependent is always the factor whose behavior we are interested in. So, when we are talking about cause behavior, cost is our dependent variable, which is shown on the y-axis. And then we relate the behavior to changes in some other factor that is affecting the behavior of the factor that we are interested in, which is called the independent variable. The independent variable by geometric convention is so shown on the x-axis. So anyway, in a regression analysis, what you do is you perform certain statistical procedures to come up with an estimates of A, which is the y-intercept, which in terms of cost would be the total fixed cost, and B, which is the slope of the line, which will tell you the variable cost per unit or whatever. The problem with the simple regression is that you can only have one independent variable. If you even think for a second, you know that costs are affected not only by production volume or production level of activity, but a number of things like supply and demand, your place in the supply chain management or the sales change management chain, depending upon geopolitical events, your geographical location. There are a multitude of factors that impact cost. So just basing all your estimates on its relationship with production volume or production level of activity is insufficient. So that you have to transition from simple regression to multiple regression, because in multiple regression you can have as many independent variables as you want. The thing to be aware of in multiple regression is not to start throwing in independent variables that are not really connected to cost, even though that will result in a higher R squared, though it will give you a lower adjusted R squared. So hopefully this helps. I have some other pointers for you. Carefully read pages 74 through 85 up to step cause behavior. You can skim through pages 85 through 89. Read pages 89 to 99, because that is where the explanation for the different quantitative methods is provided. You can kind of skim pages 100 to 104, but then read pages 105 to 112 to get an idea about simple regression and how regression is performed, levels of confidence, confidence intervals, measures of the goodness of fit, and so on. So hopefully this will help you in a small way. Thank you.